We're looking at Jeroboam, the evil influencer. Some people leave a lasting influence on society. And sadly, Jeroboam's was a terrible, terrible influence. And last week, we looked at some things, and if all we looked at was last week, you would think, wow, this man's going to be a great man of God. We saw how he was a son of a widow woman, but became a mighty man of valor. And it's not your upbringing, it's what you make out of it. And he was industrious, he was made a ruler, but he became rebellious towards Solomon. We'll talk about that. So God chose Jeroboam, and he said, you're going to get the 10 northern kingdoms. So Ahijah, the prophet, meets Jeroboam, and he's got this coat, and he rips it into 12 pieces, and he gives Jeroboam the 10 pieces. And he says, these are going to be 10 tribes that God gives you. Now, God made some special promises to Jeroboam, tremendous promises, but they were conditional promises. He said, if you listen to all my ways, if you'll obey my ways, if you do that which is right in my eyes, and if you obey all my laws like David did, he says, I am going to build you a sure house, and you are going to have somebody from your posterity, that's people that come behind you, on the throne. And what a tremendous promise. I mean, if that was the end of the story, you would think, wow, this is going to be one of the greatest kings Israel's ever had. I mean, he was a nobody, but he worked hard. He was industrious. He was a man of valor. But that's not the end of the story, sadly. And he became one of the worst, if not the worst king. And so let's continue on. In verse 40, it says, excuse me. It says, so Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak the king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So Solomon hears about this, that God is going to give Jeroboam 10 tribes, and he's not happy about it. And so we don't know how Solomon knew. Quite likely the prophet himself may have told Solomon. Now, I want us to go back to verse 26 and 27. And Jeroboam the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite of Zephatah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zerah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. And this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king. So the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king is what follows. And what follows is that Ahijah told him he was going to be ruler of the 10 tribes. But God told him something else. He lifted up his hand against the king, and that king is obviously Solomon. And when he lifts it up, it's rebelling. He's fighting against him. And he shouldn't have done it. Why should he not have done that? From what we've read in the chapter last week, does anybody remember? We'll look at verse 34 and 35 and read it through and tell me, why should he have not? Go ahead.
Because it was God's plan.
Because it's God's plan. God had told Jeroboam that you're only going to get 10 tribes. And moreover, he told Jeroboam that he's not going to do it during Solomon's life. So it would have been totally rebellious towards Solomon, but also towards God for Jeroboam to have rebelled against Solomon, right? He was told what it was to do. And compare that to David. So we have here, Jeroboam is told that you're going to get the northern kingdoms, but you're not going to get it till the death of Solomon, and you're going to get 10 tribes. So what does he do? He rebels and starts to fight against Solomon. Now look at David. David was told the same thing, basically, right? You're going to be the king. Did David try to kill Saul? No. You see, you look and you see the different hearts. David, a heart to do what's right, and Jeroboam, a heart for power. And it's sad. People tend to fight for things that they think they're going to need and get. But it was going to be in God's time, not Jeroboam's time. And Jeroboam's attitude was, I want this now. And it's rebellion because it's not what God said. God has a time for everything. God had a plan for everything. And Jeroboam says, I don't care about your plan, God. I don't care about your time. I want this now. And that's rebellion. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 23, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry, because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he also hath rejected thee from being king. That's Saul. And Saul, now he didn't want the kingdom, but once he got it, he turned away from God. But these little words, even he, verse 26, even he lifted up his hand against the king. It shows the heart of Jeroboam. Jeroboam is not satisfied with what God said. And listen to me. Your problems in your family, your problems in your church, your problems at work, often our problems, my problem starts with, I'm not willing to accept what God has said for me. And this is terrible. And so Jeroboam knew exactly what God had said, but he wanted his power now. God had told him that Solomon was going to retain his power, and he was going to remain king, and it was his son that was going to have the kingdom taken from him, but Jeroboam wasn't satisfied. Outwardly, Jeroboam's rebellion is against Solomon, right? But ultimately, it's against God. Because God had said, you're not going to get the 10 tribes till after Solomon's dead. So we see the problem with Jeroboam, but we also see a problem with Solomon. Our text verse was, what verse was that again? 40. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt under Shishak the king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Solomon knew that God had said to Jeroboam, Jeroboam is going to get 10 tribes from your son. Solomon wants to, what? Verse 40, what does Solomon want to do?
Kill Jeroboam.
So, but now, Solomon has the same problem Jeroboam had. He's not satisfied with what God said. He knows that God has said Jeroboam's going to get 10 tribes. Well, can Jeroboam get 10 tribes if Solomon kills him? No, obviously, right? So Solomon's rebellion is against God too. And it seems to me that, we know that why was Jeroboam going to get those 10 tribes? Does anybody remember? Nobody remembers? Verse 33, because they have forsaken me, because Solomon forsook God. And rather than facing the consequences of his sin and repenting, Solomon said, "Oh, well, I'll sort this out. I'll just kill Jeroboam." Listen, the only way to fix the consequences of your sin, and this may not even fix the consequences, you might still have to live with the consequences of your sin. A person that smokes all their life, cigarettes or whatever, might get cancer. They're going to live with the consequences of it. But when I sin, what I need to do is I need to repent, make restitution, and ask for forgiveness. Solomon didn't do that. He just tried to say, okay, well, I'll sort this out. And unless you do that, you're never going to have victory, and you're never going to be right with God. And see, people try to hide from the consequences of their sin. It goes way back to Adam. Adam tried to hide from God because he'd partaken of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you can't hide your sin from God, and you can't even hide it from others. Sometimes others find out about it too. So Solomon has made a major error here. He thinks that he can get away with his sin by killing somebody. And then Adam thought he could get away with his sin from his sin by hiding from it. See, Solomon tried to manipulate the circumstances to get away with the consequences of his sin. The consequences of his sin was God was going to take the 10 tribes from his son Rehoboam. That's the consequences. Solomon says, I don't want to face the consequences of that sin. Therefore, I'm going to kill the man that God says is going to be next. This is about sometime around the 24th year of Solomon. It's after he builds Milo in verse 27 there. And then, And this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king Solomon, against King. Solomon built Milo and repaired the breaches of the city of David, his father. So we know the time. And you remember, Solomon started off very, very well. But now he's turned from God. And I want to read you what Matthew Henry says about this. Solomon foolishly sought to kill his successor. Had he not taught others that whatever devices are in men's heart, the counsel of the Lord shall stand? And yet he himself thinks he can defeat that counsel. How interesting it is. Okay, so now let's go back. We know the timing of this. It says in verse 30, Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt unto Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So here we have something that's very important. We have two historical events coming together here. And this is the first time we actually get the proper name of a king of Egypt with a king of Israel. And so we know exactly when this happened. And I'm going to read you this. Shishak is the king, the first pharaoh mentioned in Scripture who can be certainly identified with any known Egyptian monarch. He is Sheshonach, or Sheshonach, the first of the monuments. And the Egyptian date for his ascension was 930 or 983. There's not the exact dates, which synchronizes with the according Hebrew reckoning of Solomon's 32nd reign. So this is really just for historical events. We can tie these two kingdoms together, and it's so interesting. Historically, and historians can find this very man ruling at the same time Solomon was ruling, and that's very interesting. But this fellow we're going to see, this Shishak, is not a friend of Solomon's. He starts off being a friend of Solomon's, but he turns. And so Jeroboam fled to Egypt. And this was a common thing for people fleeing at that time. But we have to see between the lines here that there's a bit of a problem now. If he flees to Egypt, therefore it means that the king in Egypt is going to protect him, right? Well, there's a big connection here between Solomon and the king of Egypt. What is it? It's a marriage. Solomon is married. I forgot. I think it's either the king's sister or his daughter. I should have this in my notes and I've forgotten. But they are so closely aligned. But now they're not aligned. Now, why? There's two possible reasons that I see why this king and Solomon are no longer getting together. Obviously, the first one would be that the king of Egypt would be very unpleased with Solomon taking other wives besides his Egyptian wife. And the other thing is, he could be jealousy of Solomon and his kingdom. But this Shishak actually invades Israel. If we go to chapter 14, so Solomon dies, Jeroboam gets the 10 tribes as God said, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, is made king of the southern 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah. Sometimes only just called Judah because Benjamin is smaller. But in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 25 and 26, and it came to pass in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, he even took away all. And he took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. So this Shishak that Jeroboam flees to becomes a great enemy of the southern tribes, and he takes away, he plunders the palace and he plunders the temple. But it tells us something. Jeroboam must have known that Shishak and Solomon were enemies basically by this time, right? I mean, you're not going to flee to somebody that's going to be friends with Solomon, would you? That wouldn't make any sense. So they become enemies. Now, what happens to Jeroboam? He could have fled lots of places. He could have, like David, gone around to different places in Israel. But he went to Egypt. And guess what he learned in Egypt? All kinds of false gods. In Jeremiah 10 it says, "Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them." This is a test of faith. Remember, God has said to Jeroboam, if you'll do right and live right, you'll have that kingdom, you and your posterity. And it's a test of faith. This is the first test of faith basically for Jeroboam. What are you going to do? And he takes and puts his trust in the Egyptian king rather than God. God's promise was true and secure, wasn't it? God said, you're going to be the king of the 10 northern tribes. Does he need to go to Egypt? Does he? No. God said it. God's going to protect him. In Psalm 118, verse 9, and I think this is one of the 2 middle verses in the Bible, but it says it's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. So is Jeroboam trusting the Lord or putting confidence in princes? Well, who's he trusting in? He's trusting in Shishak, the king of Egypt, right? To protect him. But that's not the way it should be. Psalm 146 verse 3 says, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help." So rather than turning to God for help, saying, God, I'm going to be that godly king you want me to be. I'm going to submit to you. Solomon's trying to kill me, Lord, but I'm trusting in you and you need to protect me. He ran to the world and learned to be like the world. And then there's the sad verse at the end of this verse. And Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, into Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. This is a very, very sad way to talk about the end of Solomon, just the death of Solomon. Solomon is such a sad character. It's pitiful when you look at his life. Started off so well. Genius, enthusiasm, everything. But he marred it by marrying an Egyptian woman and then basically turning, and then more women, and turned to the gods of the Egyptians and the gods of all the people around him. And the wisest man in the world became a fool. And what a sad thing. And let me read you this quote. The sun went down in a thick blank of clouds, which rose from an undrained marshes of his soul and stretched up high into the western horizon. His career in its glory and its shame preaches the lesson which the book of Ecclesiastes puts into his mouth as the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Sadly, Solomon didn't do it, and as we're going to see in the coming weeks, Jeroboam doesn't do it either. So, as we are studying the life of Jeroboam, we see he's started off making some very bad decisions. First bad decision is God had promised him a kingdom, and he said, I'm going to get that kingdom my way. And his way was to lift up his hand against King Solomon. He didn't do it. He didn't need to do it. God said he was going to give him the kingdom anyways, right? God didn't say, I'll give you the kingdom if you'll fight against Solomon. He said, I'm going to give you this kingdom. Just believe me. But he tried to do it his own way. And that was a very sad testimony. Listen, you don't try to get things sorted out your own way. Just leave it with God. God will sort it out. And then the second major thing we see tonight is that he went to Egypt. He shouldn't have fled to Egypt. He should have stayed in Israel. In Egypt, he learned the way of the Egyptians. And Egypt is a picture of the world and turning away from God. And that's exactly what he did. So we know when he comes back and does become king, he's not going to be a good king. Because he learned all the ways of the world. And he's just going to be like that. And what a sad testimony. And then the saddest testimony of us all is how Solomon's death is recorded. So Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak the king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Very sad ending to this for Solomon. And sadly, in the coming weeks, we're going to see the sad ending for Jeroboam and what he could have become had he just believed God and trusted in God and walked in the ways of God. But he didn't. And in the coming weeks, we're going to see what a terrible influence he had on society. Let's close in a word of prayer.